Water. Please, just a glass of water." The request was simple, spoken in a voice steady and respectful. Yet the flight attendant paused, her tray balanced on one hand, and looked down at him as if he had asked for something forbidden. Her lips curled into a tight smirk. "Sir, you'll have to wait. Don't ask again." The words cut sharper than they sounded. Around them, passengers turned their heads, sensing the tension. Some raised brows, others pretended not to notice. The man who had spoken, the black judge with years of wisdom etched into his calm face, lowered his eyes and gave a slight nod, dignified even in dismissal. But the silence that followed wasn't quiet. It pulsed. It hummed with the weight of humiliation and the sting of injustice. He hadn't demanded, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't tried to stand above anyone. All he had asked for was water. And yet in that instant, he had been reduced, made into a spectacle before strangers. What the attendant didn't know, what no one on that plane realized, was that the man sitting there in quiet restraint held the power to bring their airline to its knees with just one call. ChatGPT said, "What would you have done if you were sitting in that cabin?" Imagine watching a man ask for nothing more than a sip of water, only to be mocked and dismissed as though his dignity was disposable. Would you have stayed silent like the other passengers, pretending not to see? Or would you have spoken up, knowing the risk of drawing that humiliation onto yourself? These moments test who we really are. And that's why I need to ask you, share your thoughts in the comments below. What's the right response when someone in front of you is treated unfairly? When respect is denied over something so small yet so meaningful? And before we dive deeper into this story, make sure you subscribe for more true accounts where arrogance meets accountability, and where justice finds its voice in the most unexpected ways. Because as you're about to see, this flight was only the beginning. Moments later, something would shift, something no one on that plane could have predicted. He sat in silence, the steady thrum of the airplane's engines a backdrop to his thoughts. His frame was dignified, tall but not imposing, with shoulders that carried the quiet weight of responsibility rather than arrogance. To the strangers seated around him, he looked like just another weary traveler, a man in a simple suit, dark tie loosened, hands folded neatly over a leather briefcase. Nothing about him screamed for attention, and yet, if you watched closely, there was a gravity to his presence, a stillness that suggested this was no ordinary man. He was a judge, a federal judge who had spent decades listening before speaking, weighing truth against deception, dignity against disgrace. In courtrooms across the country, his voice carried authority, but here on this plane he carried himself with humility. He did not demand privilege. He did not expect special treatment. He asked only for what was given freely to all. This flight was supposed to be uneventful. He had just returned from a legal conference where he'd spoken to young attorneys about fairness, about the responsibility of law not to serve power, but to protect the powerless. It was a message he carried with him everywhere he went, a philosophy shaped by his own beginnings. He had grown up in the South during a time when a young black boy could be denied service at a diner, forced to walk miles home in the sweltering heat, rather than be allowed to sit inside with dignity. He remembered those days vividly, the taste of humiliation, the heavy silence of injustice. But he also remembered his mother's words, "Hold your head high. Never let anyone else decide your worth, those less." Sons built him. They made him patient, made him deliberate. They gave him the strength to endure insults with silence and answer hostility with restraint. And though he had risen to one of the highest benches in the land, those early scars had never left him. Perhaps that's why he had never sought luxury or fame. He traveled economy, just like everyone else, preferring the anonymity of the middle seat to the isolation of first class. To him, respect was not something purchased. It was something earned, something owed to every human being. As the passengers boarded around him, the cabin swelled with the familiar chaos of travel. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, elderly couples shuffled down the narrow aisle, and business travelers tapped hurriedly at glowing laptops. Bags thudded into overhead compartments. The air smelled faintly of recycled coffee and worn fabric. The judge watched it all quietly, a gentle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When a young mother struggled to lift her suitcase, he rose without hesitation, placing it overhead with an ease that drew a grateful nod. When a child accidentally kicked the back of his seat, he turned with kind eyes and said softly, "It's all right. Don't worry." He had no air of entitlement, no demand for recognition, only patience, only dignity. When the safety demonstration began, he listened politely, hands folded, eyes steady on the attendant. When the seatbelt sign chimed, he adjusted his tie and leaned back into his seat, exhaling. To him, this was just another flight home, another chance to rest his mind before returning to the stacks of case files that waited for him. Nothing more, nothing less. But life has a way of testing those who least deserve it. Because in just a few minutes, this quiet dignity, this patience forged over a lifetime, would be met with callousness so sharp it would slice through the air. And though he would endure it without raising his voice, without a hint of anger, that very restraint would set the stage for something extraordinary. Moments later, as the beverage cart rattled down the aisle, that test would arrive. A simple request, a glass of water, would become the spark. And what no one realized, not the attendant, not the passengers, not even the captain of that flight, was that the man they dismissed so casually was the same man who held the power to halt their entire airline with the press of a single button on his phone. The cart rattled closer, its wheels clicking unevenly against the narrow aisle floor. The clinking of ice cubes, the hiss of soda cans cracking open, and the polite exchanges of coffee, tea, or water filled the space around him. The judge waited patiently, as he always did, his hands folded neatly on his lap. His throat was dry, but his composure remained intact. When the attendant finally reached his row, he looked up with quiet courtesy. "Excuse me," he said, voice steady. "May I please have a glass of water?" The request was modest, spoken with the gentleness of a man who had learned long ago that politeness disarms hostility. But the attendant paused, narrowed her eyes, and tilted her head in exaggerated disbelief, as though his words were an inconvenience rather than a simple plea. "You'll have to wait," she said flatly. The tray she held didn't waver, but her tone carried a dismissive sharpness that cut into the air. She leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to drip with condescension. "Don't ask again." Passengers in the nearby rows glanced up from books and glowing screens. Some pretended to adjust headphones, but their eyes flickered toward the exchange. The silence carried an unspoken tension. The judge nodded once, lips pressed together, and sat back. His calm was deliberate, his restraint ironclad. He had lived long enough to know that responding with anger would serve no purpose. And yet, the sting was undeniable. Not the refusal of water. Phew, that was trivial. It was the contempt in her tone, the implied message that his dignity was negotiable, that he could be brushed aside without consequence. The cart moved forward, and he remained still. But moments later, when the attendant circled back down the aisle, he tried again. His voice was measured, respectful, as if giving her a chance to correct herself. "I'd still appreciate some water if it's possible." This time she stopped. Her face hardened, her lips tightening into a line. With deliberate slowness, she glanced up and down the aisle, making sure others were watching. Then she raised her voice, her words slicing through the cabin. "Sir, I already told you. You'll get water when I decide. You don't make the rules here." The words echoed. Heads turned. Whispers sparked like sparks catching on dry grass. A young man across the aisle leaned forward, brows furrowed. A middle-aged couple exchanged awkward glances, and in the row behind him, a passenger chuckled under their breath, the sound carrying the weight of ugly stereotypes too familiar to the judge. The humiliation deepened, not because of thirst, but because of the public theatre she had staged. She had chosen to elevate his simple request into a spectacle, to place him on trial before a jury of strangers. The judge's chest rose and fell slowly. His hands tightened ever so slightly around the armrest, but he said nothing. His silence, born of discipline, was misread by many as weakness. And in that moment, some passengers allowed their own biases to fill the void. A woman whispered to her companion, "Why can't he just wait like everyone else?" Another muttered, "Always complaining about something." Their words, quiet but venomous, cut deeper than the attendant's voice. The attendant smirked, satisfied. She leaned in once more, as though twisting the knife. "If you keep pressing this issue, sir, I'll have to notify the captain, and trust me, you don't want that." The insinuation was clear, a threat, a suggestion that he was a problem passenger, a disruption, a danger. The very labels that had haunted men like him for generations, labels that could escalate a minor moment into a life-altering disaster. His jaw clenched, but his eyes remained calm. He had presided over courtrooms where tempers flared, where the dignity of law was tested by anger and arrogance. He knew restraint better than most. And yet, here he sat, being tried in the court of public opinion, judged not for his character, but for the colour of his skin. Minutes dragged on. The cart disappeared up the aisle, laughter and conversation resuming around him, though the tension lingered like smoke. His throat was parched, but the thirst was nothing compared to the burn of injustice. Whispers continued. A teenage boy leaned toward his mother. "What's going on?" She hushed him, shaking her head. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, torn between the urge to intervene and the fear of becoming targets themselves. No one spoke on his behalf. No one said, "That isn't right." Silence, the oldest accomplice of injustice, filled the cabin. The judge sat straighter, his composure a shield. He would not let them see him break. He would not surrender his dignity, even as they tried to strip it away. When the attendant passed again, offering drinks to others with a wide, practiced smile, she didn't so much as glance at him. The omission was intentional, deliberate, a statement for all to see. And the passengers saw it. Some watched with quiet shame, others with indifference, and a few with judgment. The cabin had become a stage, and the judge was cast as both the supplicant and the scapegoat. But what no one realized, what not even the attendant understood, was that the man they mocked had once stood in courtrooms deciding the fate of corporations larger than this airline, that his rulings had shifted the course of industries, had held billion-dollar summons, companies accountable for the smallest violations of dignity and fairness. The irony was profound. They had mistaken patience for powerlessness. The judge leaned back, closing his eyes, breathing deeply. The humiliation settled like a weight on his chest, but beneath it, something stronger stirred. He thought of his mother's words once more. "Hold your head high. Never let anyone else decide your worth." So he endured. He endured the whispers, the side glances, the disdain. He endured it all in silence. But deep within that silence, he was making a decision. A decision that would shift the balance of power in ways none of them could have imagined. Because soon, with one call, the humiliation they had orchestrated would recoil back onto them with a force strong enough to shake an entire airline to its core. And justice, quiet, patient, inevitable, was already on its way. The plane hummed steadily at cruising altitude, but inside the judge's chest, silence pressed heavier than the roar of the engines. He sat upright, his eyes fixed on nothing, hands folded on his lap as if in prayer. Around him, the cabin had already moved on. Passengers scrolled through phones, children dozed off, attendants laughed quietly among themselves. But the sting of what had just unfolded still lingered in the air, invisible yet undeniable.
He did not speak. He did not demand. He did not protest. He had long ago mastered the art of enduring slights that would have broken lesser men. His restraint was not weakness, it was a shield. And so, when the cart passed again without so much as a glance in his direction, he lowered his gaze, lips pressed into a thin line, and let the moment pass. His throat was dry, but thirst was no longer what burned inside him. What burned was the memory of the attendant's mocking voice, the snickers that followed, the silent complicity of those who looked away. It was not the water denied, it was the respect denied. That wound cut deeper. Minutes stretched into hours. The plane rocked gently through turbulence. Tense, but his posture never wavered. He endured, patiently, silently. The very patience he had once counseled young lawyers to cultivate was now his only companion. It was the kind of patience born not from choice, but from necessity. Patience carved by decades of learning that to react too quickly, too loudly, was to confirm the very prejudice waiting to condemn you. As the wheels finally touched down on the runway, the cabin jolted. Seatbelts clicked open, phones buzzed with reconnection, voices swelled with relief. The humiliation seemed forgotten by everyone else. But not by him. For the judge, it had etched itself into memory with painful clarity. He reached for his briefcase, smooth leather worn from years of service. His hands moved calmly, but inside his mind, calculations had already begun. He was not a man to retaliate with anger or spectacle. His life had been built on the slow, deliberate weight of justice, justice that did not shout, but struck with precision. As the passengers shuffled off the plane, he moved with them, quiet and unassuming. The attendant who had humiliated him offered a bright smile to others, chirping polite farewells, but when her eyes flicked toward him, her lips tightened, and she looked away. Even now she dismissed him as unworthy of acknowledgement. He walked down the jet bridge, his steps steady, measured. The stale air gave way to the terminal's wide, echoing corridors, filled with the sounds of rolling suitcases and hurried announcements. He did not rush. He did not scowl. Instead, he paused at an empty corner of the terminal, where the noise dulled just enough to make his voice heard. He slipped his phone from his pocket. The device glowed softly in his palm, its screen reflecting in his steady eyes. He scrolled briefly, his thumb precise, deliberate, until it stopped on a single number. A number not many would recognize, one that carried weight far beyond the walls of any courtroom. He pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked alive. His voice, low and controlled, carried none of the humiliation he had endured. "It's me," he said simply. A pause followed, filled with the faint murmur of someone on the other end. His lips pressed tighter as he listened. "I just stepped off a flight," he continued. "We need to talk about how this airline treats its passengers, especially who they choose to humiliate." There was silence, then a response, firm, attentive, almost startled. The judge did not raise his voice, but each word he spoke was deliberate, layered with authority earned over decades. "I want this reviewed. Immediately. Do you understand?" The voice on the other end assured him, promised action, promised attention. He ended the call with a single tap, sliding the phone back into his pocket as though it were nothing, and to anyone watching, it might have seemed like just another traveler making just another phone call. But it wasn't. That call had been a stone dropped into still water, and its ripples would travel far beyond this terminal. He straightened his tie, lifted his briefcase, and walked calmly toward the exit. Around him, travelers hurried, oblivious. But in the quiet gravity of his step, something had shifted. The humiliation he endured would not vanish into silence. It was already in motion, already reaching rooms where men and women in power would have no choice but to listen. For the airline, What had seemed like a moment of dominance, a dismissal of a thirsty passenger, was about to become the seed of reckoning, because the man they had chosen to belittle was no ordinary passenger. And while he had endured in silence aboard that plane, justice would not remain silent for long. Moments later, as he stepped into the cool night air outside the terminal, he breathed deeply, not with anger, but with certainty. He had made the call. The rest would follow. And what no one realized, not the attendant, not the passengers, not even the airline itself, was that this single act of arrogance would soon bring their multi-million-dollar operations grinding to a halt. The morning after the flight, the airline's headquarters buzzed with its usual rhythm, phones ringing, executives buried in emails, operations moving at their relentless pace. But then, a call came through that froze everything. A federal oversight committee had demanded an urgent review of passenger treatment policies, citing an incident on one of their flights. The language was sharp, official, and carried the weight of authority that no corporation dared ignore. The executives scrambled, voices rising over one another, confusion spreading like wildfire. What incident? Which passenger? What had gone so wrong that it bypassed customer service channels and landed straight on the desks of Washington's regulators? The answer came swiftly, and it struck like lightning. The passenger humiliated, the man denied the most basic courtesy of water, was not just anyone. He was a sitting federal judge, one of the most respected voices on civil rights and corporate accountability. His rulings had once redefined how major companies treated their workers, reshaping industries with a single stroke of his pen. He was a man who knew the law not just as words in a book, but as a force capable of bending giants to fairness. And now that same man had been mocked, denied, and threatened by one of their attendants, in full view of dozens of witnesses. The revelation spread quickly. Managers whispered his name in hushed tones, fear creeping into their voices. Departments were ordered to pull records, gather reports, and prepare explanations that could never fully undo what had already been set in motion. The gravity of their mistake settled in like a storm cloud. Meanwhile, passengers who had been on that flight began sharing fragments of the story online. A man was refused water. The attendant humiliated him. Some had filmed portions of the exchange, shaky phone videos capturing the edge in the attendant's voice, the judge's quiet dignity and contrast. At first, the posts gained little traction, but when one user added the detail, "Turns out he's a federal judge," the narrative flipped. The internet devoured it. The story spread like wildfire, igniting outrage and fascination in equal measure. Inside the airline's boardroom, panic turned to dread. Their legal team understood what this meant. A federal judge wasn't just another unhappy customer. His word carried weight, his testimony could trigger investigations, and his influence reached deep into the corridors of power that oversaw their very license to operate. And yet, the man himself did nothing to boast. No press conference, no interviews, no grandstanding. He remained silent, his authority speaking louder than any words could. His reputation alone, coupled with that single phone call, had tilted the balance of power so completely that the airline now scrambled to protect itself from ruin. The same crew who had laughed him off, who had smirked at his simple request, now whispered his title in disbelief. The attendant who had humiliated him was pulled from duty, summoned into urgent meetings where her bravado collapsed into trembling explanations. But the truth was undeniable. She had mocked a man who embodied the very system that could hold her employer accountable. What no one on that plane had realized was that authority does not always announce itself. True power often sits quietly, observing, patient, waiting for the right moment to act. And when it does not need to raise its voice. It does not need to strike with fury. It only needs to reveal itself, and the entire room changes. That was the shift now consuming the airline. They had mistaken humility for weakness, silence for insignificance. They had rated a man as though he were disposable, when in reality he was a guardian of justice with the means to hold them to the highest standard. And while the judge himself never gloated, never sought revenge, the very act of revealing who he was had already flipped the dynamic. He no longer needed to demand respect. It had been forced upon those who once denied it, as they realized the enormity of their mistake. In boardrooms and regulatory offices, in whispered conversations among airline staff, his name was now spoken with reverence and fear. And for the passengers who had witnessed the humiliation firsthand, the revelation rewrote the memory of that flight. They now understood they had seen not a powerless man shamed, but a powerful man choosing patience, even as injustice tested him. Moments later, as the investigation deepened and calls for accountability spread, the airline braced for consequences it could not escape. Because when power reveals itself, there is no undoing the silence that preceded it. There is only the reckoning that follows. The storm broke quickly. Within hours of the judge's call, the airline's polished facade began to crack. In a towering glass building far from the airport, executives sat stunned as news filtered in. Regulators had opened an immediate inquiry. Government contracts worth millions were suddenly under review. Payments scheduled for release were frozen without warning. Their operations, once a smooth-running machine, now stumbled under the weight of legal scrutiny. Phones buzzed with urgency, conference lines lit up with frantic voices, and the atmosphere inside the boardroom turned suffocating. The incident, which crew members had dismissed as trivial, was now dictating the future of the airline itself. The federal notice was clear. A high-profile passenger had been denied basic service, subjected to humiliation and threat, and aboard one of their flights. The fact that this passenger was a federal judge only deepened the severity. It wasn't just bad optics. It was a direct challenge to the integrity of their entire operation. Managers scrambled to gather reports. Every word spoken on that flight, every action taken by the crew became evidence. Surveillance logs were pulled. Cabin staff were called in one by one, their confident tones from the day before now replaced by anxious stammers. The very attendant who had mocked the judge sat pale and silent in a disciplinary hearing, her bravado gone. She understood that her words had sparked a crisis capable of collapsing everything she had once taken for granted. Meanwhile, the world outside the airline's walls erupted. Passengers who had remained silent during the flight found their voices online. Posts appeared across social media. "I was there. A man asked for water, and they mocked him." Others uploaded shaky videos, capturing fragments of the humiliation, the sharp tone of the attendant, the calm restraint of the judge. The videos spread with alarming speed. Headlines followed. Federal judge humiliated on flight. Airline faces crisis after discrimination incident. Outrage mounted, not just at the treatment of the judge, but at the deeper reflection of society's biases laid bare. The story was no longer about one glass of water. It was about dignity, respect, and the arrogance of power unchecked. Within days, ticket sales dropped sharply. Partner corporations hesitated to renew contracts. Government agencies distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a brand now synonymous with public humiliation. Shareholders demanded answers. The airline's once booming stock began to wobble, the numbers bleeding red. Inside the company, panic gave way to paralysis. Meetings stretched late into the night, executives arguing over strategies that all seemed too little, too late. They released public statements, carefully worded apologies, promised of comprehensive training. But the words rang hollow against the tide of viral fury. The public had already judged them, and the verdict was merciless. And through it all, the judge said nothing. He gave no interviews, issued no statements. He did not need to. His silence became more powerful than any speech. His role in the unfolding crisis was quiet, but undeniable. Everyone knew it was his phone call that had sparked the chain reaction, his reputation that had compelled regulators to act, his presence that had turned humiliation into a corporate reckoning.
The same attendant who had once wielded power over him with a smirk and a sharp word now sat in the shadows of disgrace. Her name leaked online, her face attached to the story she could never erase. She had thought she was silencing a passenger. Instead, she had awakened a storm. The airline's humiliation was complete. What had begun as the dismissal of one man had become a cautionary tale repeated across boardrooms and classrooms alike. Treat every passenger with respect, executives warned, because you never know who is watching. But the true consequence was deeper than policy changes or suspended contracts. The airline had revealed its character under pressure, and the world had judged it unfit. By the end of the week, operations slowed to a crawl. Flights were delayed as crews were pulled for emergency training. Legal teams spent sleepless nights drafting responses to mounting investigations. Multi-million-dollar deals were placed on indefinite hold. Their once proud empire of air travel, built on efficiency and prestige, now stumbled like a wounded giant. And all of it had begun with a single request, a simple plea spoken softly on a crowded plane. "May I please have some water?" The humiliation of one man had grown into the humiliation of an entire corporation. What had been dismissed as trivial had become monumental, and the world was watching, ensuring that the lesson would not be forgotten. Yet even as the airline scrambled, one truth remained unshakable. The judge had never needed to raise his voice, never needed to demand revenge. Justice, steady and unrelenting, had answered on his behalf. The reckoning was not loud. It was not violent, but it was absolute. And for the airline, the storm had only just begun. The storm eventually passed, as all storms do, but its memory lingered in the corridors of power and the conscience of those who witnessed it. For the judge, life returned to its quiet rhythm of hearings, rulings, and moments of solitude. Yet the events of that flight had carved a lesson deeper than any gavel strike or courtroom verdict. He had never raised his voice. He had never shouted, never demanded vengeance. His silence had not been weakness. It had been strength, a strength sharpened by years of enduring the quiet cruelty of prejudice, and a strength that, in this moment, revealed a truth many overlook. Dignity does not require volume. Dignity requires resolve. The airline's humiliation became a global story, but his role in it remained understated. He did not bask in the spectacle, nor did he seek credit for the fallout. His power lay in restraint, in letting the truth surface on its own. And when it did, the world saw the contrast with unmistakable clarity, arrogance exposed against the calm endurance of justice. Passengers who had sat silently on that flight reflected differently now. Some admitted their shame, realizing they had been complicit by saying nothing. Others confessed that they had misjudged him in those tense moments, assuming he was powerless when in fact he carried more influence than anyone on that plane. Their silence, once a shield of indifference, now felt like a weight pressing on their conscience. But that too was part of the lesson. Injustice thrives in silence, yet silence can also be the sword that cuts it down when wielded with purpose. His silence had not been the silence of surrender, but the silence of patience, of a man who understood that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes justice simply waits for the right moment to strike. And so the moral echoes louder than any headline. Treat every human being with respect, because you do not know their story. You do not know their scars, their resilience, or the quiet power they carry. The person you dismiss with a smirk may be the very one who holds your future in their hands. But the lesson is not only for corporations and attendants in pressed uniforms, it is for each of us. In our daily lives, we are faced with choices, moments to dismiss or to uplift, to look away or to step forward, to belittle or to honor. These moments, small as they may seem, reveal who we are more than grand gestures ever could. The judge's story reminds us that power is not always loud. It does not always wear a badge or demand recognition.
Sometimes it sits quietly in a window seat, asking only for a glass of water. And when mistreated, it does not rage. It endures until the moment comes to reveal itself. Justice does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in silence, with a phone call that changes everything. For the airline, that silence shattered their empire of arrogance. For the passengers, it became a memory they could not erase. And for the world, it was a reminder etched into the headlines. That dignity is not granted by others. It is held within, and no amount of cruelty can strip it away. So remember this. The next time you are tempted to dismiss a stranger, pause. The next time you see injustice, ask yourself whether silence is protecting cruelty or preserving dignity. And the next time you find yourself judged unfairly, know this truth. You do not need to shout to be heard, because silence waits.
An anchored in dignity speaks louder than any voice, and justice, though patient, always finds its way. That is the power of restraint.